This lecture covers all the different types of water resources that we have here on Earth and the pollution that plagues those water sources. Although the oceans are the largest source of water, the Great Lakes and some other lakes around the world contain a significant portion. The Great Lakes themselves, in between the United States and Canada, contain 20% of the world's surface freshwater. The lakes also have quite a bit of pollution. They're subject to pollution because there's a lot of different civilizations and cities around the lakes with industrial and agricultural processes that through runoff feed into those lakes. Lake Baikal in Siberia is another one of the world's largest lakes, and it contains a lot of the world's fresh water, and the Great Rift Lakes of Africa. Let's look at the proportions of water resources throughout the earth. So, of all water on Earth, 3% is fresh water, 97% is saline in the ocean. If you take just the fresh water and split that apart, you'll see that about 70% is frozen in ice caps and glaciers, 30% is stored as groundwater, and the rest is surface water and other. If you take just the surface water, the fresh water that's on the surface in liquid form, 87% of that is lakes, 11% swamps, and 2% rivers. There's a lot more groundwater than surface water, if that's what those last two bars are supposed to tell you. And I'm kind of wondering what that other is. Maybe that's the water that's inside organisms like you and me. A short refresher on water as it moves in and through plants. Water gets stored in the soil, and water is absorbed through the roots of plants, and once it's used in biochemical processes, respiration, and photosynthesis, some water evaporates out of the body of the plant into the atmosphere, and then later that might turn into a cloud, rain down, and refill the soil. The process of water leaving from the inside of the plant to the outside is called transpiration. It's a little bit like, not completely, like perspiration in animals. And a simple graphic of a very small hydrological cycle, starting with precipitation coming down onto the land. Some of that rain percolates into the topsoil that plants might utilize. Some will infiltrate even further down through porous rocks down into the water table that's stored groundwater, not where the plant roots are, but below that. When we hear of people pumping groundwater for crops or from their well, it's usually the water table down below soil water. And then that could fill a river, it could fill a creek, it could be pumped up. All of that water table, not all of it, but some of it and a lot of it is getting used by humans and pumped back up and utilized, and it can go back into the atmosphere, either evaporation from the river or use in crops and evaporation once it's on the surface and go back into the atmosphere where it could come back down again as precipitation. And let's take one of those water types, groundwater, and look more closely at that. Kind of a cool image of water inside of a cave down below the surface. This is a very unusual type of groundwater resource. Most water that is groundwater is in porous rock, so like a big kind of deposit of sand underneath the earth will hold a lot of water in it, and when you drill a well and hit water and you pump it out, it's usually from that kind of system, from porous rock. It's not just a big pocket like this of pure water that's like a little lake down there. Normally it's in porous rock. And this slide shows that a little bit more clearly, what it would look like. So you got surface water, like in this pond. An aquifer is an underground layer of water-bearing permeable rock. So sandy, gravelly, something that's got a lot of porosity and little pore spaces and holes in it that can hold water, but it's still a semi-solid layer. Permeable rock are layers of porous rock and sand capable of holding water that make up that aquifer. And groundwater is the water that saturates the soil, sand, and rock beds, supplying springs and wells. So it could be any of those things. Vegetation helps reduce flooding by the plant's roots creating channels for water to infiltrate instead of run off into the sewer drains or down into the creek or river or ocean. These plant roots help create those pores and channels so water can get deeper into the soil, sometimes refilling the permeable rock layers, the aquifer, and recharging the groundwater. Here's one of the largest aquifers, the Ogallala Aquifer, spanning where you see there, kind of like south to upper and western Midwest of the United States. It's a huge area that it covers. It's called fossil water or paleo water, and this water was filled up and put in those porous rock layers in this area a long time ago, thousands of years ago. And this aquifer is commercially extremely important right now. There's all kinds of agriculture throughout this area that use this ancient water source and pump it up and use it for agriculture mostly, and it's being drawn down. So if it is drained more and more, it would take about 6,000 years to refill it naturally, and about 90% of the water that's pumped out of this is to irrigate crops, which equals about $20 billion a year in food produced and fiber. So this is extremely important aquifer. It's being drawn down at current rates of withdrawal are unsustainable. It's expected in the next 80 years there will not be any water left to withdraw, and that's going to be a big problem. So our groundwater resources have to be controlled and managed, especially these ones that are paleo water that were refilled a long time ago. They're not getting refilled right now, or barely at all. Other groundwater sources do get replenished more readily and more quickly, and those aren't as problematic. Now let's look at surface freshwater resources, mostly rivers, creeks, lakes. Wetlands are considered part of that. They're usually the outlet or the edges of rivers and creeks and lakes where water comes into the ocean. That's an estuary. It's a type of wetland. Wetlands are really important for water management and for slowing the water down and letting it sink in and infiltrate into the soil and groundwater. Vegetation on land can help reduce the impact of water on land, reducing erosion. That's a really important thing to think about, reducing erosion. But it also helps water infiltrate into the soil and reducing flooding in that way too. So lots of benefits and functions of wetlands as our surface water resource. A nice little diagram showing you how much water is actually needed to produce 1 kilogram of food. And it varies with the type of food that you're growing, of course. If you're trying to raise beef, it's going to take a lot more than it will be to raise 1 kilogram of tomato food instead of beef food. So water, things like meat are very water intensive food producing processes as opposed to vegetables and plant foods. Those take a lot less water to produce. So eating down on the food chain, like vegetarianism, doesn't mean you have to eat none, but maybe just a lot less of animal products will really help us conserve water. And here's a list of some of the most water intensive industries, starting with agriculture, but all these other ones too. You wouldn't think of it, but often machinery has to be cooled. It heats up when it's doing its processes. The machine's parts create friction. Water is often used to cool these machines. Not always, but a lot of it. So things that you wouldn't even think of require water, like metals and mining, or mining of metals. That also takes a lot of water too, especially when the ore is being crushed and washed out to get to the metals. Deforestation and overgrazing on the land, human practices. They can also affect the water supplies by increasing evaporation and decreasing infiltration. As I mentioned earlier, plants' roots intact, growing plants in the soil help water infiltrate. When a forest is removed because it wants to be turned over into agriculture or like a crop or pasture, that seriously reduces that piece of land's ability to absorb water and infiltrate into groundwater resources. Even hold on to it for just a little while for creeks and rivers too, so they don't get overloaded. So plant roots help the water sink in and recharge the groundwater and shallow water in the soil too, which helps the whole system. Landscaping is also a really big water consumptive practice by humans. The outdoors of homes takes about 60 to 70% of the residential water use. You can see there clothes washing, shower, toilets, leaks, faucets. Those take sizable portion, but nowhere near what it takes in the outdoor portion. If people switch to water conservation techniques using gray water outside, that's partially used water, not toilet, but like sink and shower, has little soap in it, but it's fine for plants. Using native plants that do not require extra water or very little, those are great methods to reduce this big green piece of the pie here to a much smaller amount. And now we're entering another section of the lecture. It's all about marine pollution. There's a bunch of slides with a little intro here, but we'll get into oil spills in just one more slide. Let's first distinguish between biodegradable and non-biodegradable pollutants in the ocean. Some of these pollutants that enter the ocean can be degraded by the microbes' metabolism, and they've broken down hydrocarbons, whatever it is. If it's like an oil spill, that would be hydrocarbons. They can be broken down by microbes, and the products are carbon dioxide and water and other metabolic byproducts such as methane, methanol, ethanol, all things that are naturally found in the environment. So they're not so bad. There's also non-biodegradable pollutants, and those don't get broken down and they're more persistent. And we'll talk about those a little later. And now let's talk about oil spills and a few well-known ones. Dun, dun, dun. On January 28th of 1969, on a platform off the coast of Santa Barbara, Ventura area, there was a blowout of a well, and oil started spilling for the next 10 days until February 7th. And this was at the time the largest oil spill in the history of the United States. And now there's been two other big oil spills in the United States. This still ranks third. So a lot of oil came out and caused a lot of damage over a wide area. And you may know too, though, that this is why Earth Day started in Santa Barbara in 1969. Activists and people that cared were very upset that this happened, and that means that the oil drilling process and industry was not being safe or not environmentally safe, and something people got together to honor protecting the earth by starting Earth Day, which is now a national holiday. But it all started here in Santa Barbara. That's the Santa Barbara Harbor, showing you all of the oil and just gunked up oil and debris in January of 1969. I love this quote. The president of the Union Oil Company, who was responsible for this spill in 1969, said, "I don't like to call it a disaster because there's been no loss of human life. I'm amazed at the publicity for the loss of a few birds." Well, we don't want to judge that person too harshly. Maybe a little. They should have known better. But our awareness about the environment and the interconnectedness of all species and how important it is has vastly changed since then, and partly as a result of this crisis. The same year as the Santa Barbara oil spill, a river caught fire in Ohio. The Cuyahoga River had an oil slick on it. These are oil that's released from industrial companies right on the river. They positioned themselves when they were built on the river so they could let out some of their waste products into the river, but so much oil was released at this one time on June 22nd that it actually caught fire. So those two things, the Cuyahoga River catching fire and the Santa Barbara oil spill, brought a lot of awareness. These were two crises that brought awareness about water quality and water pollution across the nation. It had been actually on fire 13 times recorded since the last 100 years, but this one, in conjunction with the Santa Barbara oil spill, really caught everyone's attention. Another major oil spill that caused massive fossil fuel pollution to go into the marine environment was when the Exxon Valdez oil tanker ran aground in Alaska, near the town of Valdez in 1989. 11 million gallons were spilled. It spread very far, 12,000 miles, and about 3,200 miles of coastline was oiled, equivalent to the entire west coast of America. So this is an area so polluted that it is still seeing the effects of it, has not completely recovered. In one study, 20 years after the Valdez oil spill, it was found that 15 of the 24 species studied had not fully recovered. And then in 2010, the Deepwater Horizon oil rig, the platform in the Gulf of Mexico, that exploded and killed 11 people. 126 workers were on there, 17 other people were hurt, and it caused a massive oil spill. In the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, 206 million gallons of oil flowed into the Gulf marine environment. This made it the second worst oil spill in history. One of the things learned from the Deepwater Horizon oil spill is that the oil that's spilled doesn't just stay on the surface, it goes pretty deep, and it can form an oil plume that is widespread and deep in the water as well. Before that, it was thought that you can see the oil spreading on the surface of the ocean, that it was the shallow water where the plume and the oil stayed. But that is not the case. The worst oil spill in the Earth's history, not the United States, from which we've been talking about so far, was in the Gulf War in 1991. So the Persian Gulf, not the Gulf of Mexico that we talked about with Deepwater Horizon. But the Persian Gulf, in that war, 240 to 336 million gallons of oil was spilled, and it just devastated the terrestrial, the land environment, like you're seeing in the picture, and the aquatic environment. And this slide is just to let you know that some of the reasons that the oil spilled was because of the war and the bombing, and we were fighting over oil too. So in a large sense, it was an economic war, and it was over our ability to continue getting the oil we need to the United States. So it was a tragedy, and fought over oil, and further polluted our marine environment in that area as well. This is kind of a cool picture of local areas around here. Summerlin Beaches, just south of Santa Barbara. There are lots of oil rigs were around here. You can still see some, and we know that even near downtown on the Mesa, there were oil rigs on land. We have some offshore here. There's a fair amount of oil reserves all around here. And some are still leaking. And even more recently, a few years ago, one was leaking right up here near Santa Barbara City College in someone's backyard. It was an old oil rig, not rig, but hole or well, and it had to be more securely capped off so it stopped leaking. Oil, coal, and tar all associated with natural seeps from the ocean floor, but also from oil spills. They all contain this polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, which are really toxic to vertebrates and invertebrates. They have toxic, carcinogenic, mutagenic, and teratogenic effects. This oil will, these compounds, because of those compounds in the oil, it inhibits plankton growth, fish growth, reproduction, the health of fisheries, loss of human jobs. It hurts humans too, these compounds, and seabird and mammal populations as well. And what you're looking at is cleanup workers. Some of them are ExxonMobil employees, and they're coated with all of this oil, and it was the volatilization of those oils that they breathed in and made a lot of the workers sick, even though ExxonMobil denies that the cleanup work made anyone sick at all. But 6,700 workers reported respiratory problems. So there's that part too. It's not just touching the oil or having it coating your body or an animal's body, but it's also in the air. As we look here at some other aspects of water pollution, let's talk about dissolved oxygen. So aquatic organisms need oxygen in the water. The fish do, some aquatic animals. And you're looking here at a scale of the amount of dissolved oxygen, milligrams per liter or parts per million. When it gets low into the purple, it can kill fish and aquatic animals. It can be stressful for them if there's a little bit higher oxygen levels, but not very high in that red and yellow zone. Moderate levels are okay, and even higher levels are great. But you have to realize that that these, even though it's a little low, that can cause some stress and then really low death for aquatic animals. They depend on that, having that oxygen in the water. Sediment coming into the ocean from erosion on land and maybe not really very sustainable agriculture practices that leaves land bare or tilled part of the year, and then rains come and the sediments from the soil get washed down and into the ocean. And those sediments can reduce the amount of oxygen in the water, which can tip the dissolved oxygen levels into that bad zone for aquatic organisms. In the case of kelp forests, the sediments can also cover up the places where the kelps attach, the baby kelp organisms, which are free floating. They need some place to attach to grow, and if it gets covered up by sediment, then there's nowhere for them to attach, and the kelp forests can decline. Another way that oxygen levels in aquatic systems can get to dangerously low levels is from eutrophication. Nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus are used as fertilizers in agriculture, and they also run off from livestock operations from the manure, and that can get into our aquatic systems, lakes and rivers, and over nutrify too much nitrogen and phosphorus in those things, creating an algal bloom, which can consume a lot of oxygen in the water and take that dissolved oxygen level down to a dangerous level for other aquatic organisms. Water can be also contaminated with heavy metals, and those are dangerous to living organisms in the water. They can build up in the living tissues, bioaccumulate, and get to a certain concentration level within their tissues that are toxic. Arsenic is a good example of one of them, and you're seeing their sources here in this diagram. Pesticides, particulates, industrial chemicals, etc. Thermal pollution is another type of water pollution where human industry changes the temperature, makes it too warm. This is an interesting kind of example, and not necessarily all bad, but this is a nuclear power plant in Florida, and they discharge, they use water to cool the reactor towers for generating nuclear power, and that warm water is put out into the ocean. These nuclear power plants there are, like most of them, are situated right near a large water source, often right near the ocean. And that warm water pouring out of the plants has inadvertently become excellent winter refuge habitat for manatees. You can see all these manatees flocking to the warm water, and those manatees are protected. And so it's an interesting thing. We can't just shut the nuclear power plant down because now it's protected animal habitat. So complex situation. In the last few slides here, I want to discuss how we protect our water resources with laws, policies, and some activism. This is a great quote from Albert Einstein. We cannot solve our problems with the same thinking we used when we created them. So, and that's what we need to do with all of our environmental problems and other problems too, is have a whole new framework for thinking about how to solve these issues. Um, this this young man, Boyan Slat, he did a TED Talk in 2012, but before that he started this organization, nonprofit called the Ocean Cleanup Organization, and single-handedly created a pretty good workforce to start cleaning up ocean garbage. You can do it too. Anyone can. As mentioned earlier, the oil spill in Santa Barbara and the Cuyahoga River in Ohio catching on fire spawns environmental protection awareness. The Environmental Protection Agency was formed only a year later. Clean Water Act was passed just 2 years later, and a number of other important environmental pieces of legislation. Endangered Species Act was around the same time too, and the National Environmental Policy Act and the Clean Air Act. The Clean Water Act establishes the basic structure for regulating pollution in U.S. waters. It gives Americans a right to waterways that are clean, biologically intact, safe for use, sometimes to swim in, and includes a bunch of different programs to help reach that goal. Before that, we didn't have anything that said that we had to protect them, and companies, private parties could just dump whatever they want into the oceans and rivers. So it's really important. Even though it's not perfect, it's an important step. The picture is showing you plastics hotspots, so aquatic and marine plastic garbage hotspots that are along the California coast. Very local to Santa Barbara is the Arroyo Burro watershed. It's a creek that runs into the ocean from an area called the Mesa. And this beach water has been, by an outside entity, a nonprofit, has tested the quality of beach waters for years. And before the restoration was done, this beach, Hendry's Beach, always got an F. As a grade for water quality. It was always very bad water quality. So much pesticide, fertilizer, sediment runoff, and into this creek that runs right into the ocean. And but about 20 years ago, they started restoring this creek, the natural vegetation, the lagoon, and the ponds that come right before it gets into the ocean. So the water settles in, sinks in. They've established a lot of wetland plants to help purify that water, and it's improved the water quality significantly. So it's possible for us to do this. There's lots of simple technologies out there to help clean up our waters, and we just have to take action and support those pieces of legislation and those organizations that work for that.